to another edition of Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal. We are bringing you another series of the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. As in this episode, as we're approaching Veterans Day, we felt it appropriate to take you to Andersonville, the former site of the Union POW camp during the American Civil War. Also, of course, the home to the National Cemetery here, which is still in use today, and also the POW Museum. Now, that's all of what we're going to be bringing you. And as you can see in the background, the camp line, some of the monuments that were erected by many of the people in the North to honor their fallen who died here at Andersonville. We're going to be taking you to the museum and finding out more about this National Historic Site operated by the National Park Service. It's all coming up for you on this episode of Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal. Sure glad to have you along.
It was an era of brother against brother, father against son, American versus American. From 1861 to 1865, this country was divided like it never has been before or since. More Americans died during the bloody conflict than in all of the wars of the 20th century combined. If the first casualty of war is the truth, then surely the second are the combatants, and the third would be those who had the misfortune of becoming a prisoner of war. On what grew to become the largest and one of the most infamous POW camps during the American Civil War, some 45,000 Union POWs would call Andersonville their hellish home during the last year and a half of the conflict.
Life for a Union POW, once inside these gates, was not pleasant. The walls here constructed 17 feet high, and the boards built by slave labor from trees felled on this exact site, as these are reproductions of what the camp would have been built and the walled fortifications would have been to hold the prisoners. They were put together so closely as to not let them even get much of a glimpse of the outside forest land or the outside world. For a Union POW during the American Civil War, being sent to Andersonville was tantamount to a death sentence. Eric Leonard, the Chief Ranger here at Andersonville, joins us now. And initially, the site was just the prisoner or the prison encampment.
Mm-hmm. We begin as the Camp Sumter Military Prison, which operated the final 14 months of the American Civil War, and associated with that is, of course, today what we call the historic prison site, and then what has become the Andersonville National Cemetery.
And of course, the National Cemetery, there are literally thousands of former Union POWs who are interred there.
It's just under 13,000 prisoners died here. Statistically speaking, that's an average of 1 out of every 3 out of the 45,000 men that were held here in those 14 months of the war.
Almost 13,000 of them would never see their homes, families, or fellow soldiers again.
Here we're inside now, the rebuilt palisade, the rebuilt wall, double gated, and of course, something that we in TV and radio news often hear is a deadline. Well, the deadline actually emerged from camps like this. For if a prisoner got within that line towards the wall, that's what they would wind up being. We continue on now with more scenes from Andersonville National Historic Site on this week's Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal, paying tribute to our service personnel and our veterans, and we appreciate each and every one of you.
Andersonville, then officially known as Camp Sumter, was built in early 1864. Its enclosures were built by slave labor who felled the trees on the site to make the stockade walls of the camp. The prison initially covered about 16.5 acres, but would be expanded to cover over 26 acres by June of 1864. Despite the amount of acreage, the sheer number of prisoners far exceeded the allotted space, and overcrowding was the least of the captives' problems. Disease, inadequate housing, lack of medical care, and provisions would lead to the deaths of the prisoners to the tune averaging almost 1,000 each month. Once inside, prisoners would find themselves under the view of the guards, positioned in what they began to call them pigeon roosts, about every 30 yards atop the 15 to 17-foot high walls. Most of the guards were not regular soldiers, as Ranger Eric Leonard explains.
They were, most of them during most of the prison's operation are members actually of the Georgia Reserves, which, as the name in fact implies, the reserves were not intended as battle-ready units. It's generally composed of older men and then teenagers. And on the occasions that you have combat veterans of the Confederate Army serving as guards here, the prisoners noticed. And they always missed those men when they went away, just for the fact that the prisoners are all battle-hardened combat veterans of the war. And they felt that there was a level of respect among, even if you're fighting on a different side, if you've been in battle, you treat those captured men with a different level of respect than you might if you're 15 years old and you've got a shotgun, but you've never seen a battle.
The captors endured many of the same stresses as their captives. Supplies were short for the Confederate Army and shorter still for those back on the home front. Even less was available for the unfortunate Union POWs inside of Camp Sumter. Andersonville may be the best known of the POW camps of the Civil War, but there were many, many more. They became a necessity for both sides after prisoner exchanges were abandoned. Once again, here's Ranger Eric Leonard.
I know Stoneman's Raid was an attempt to actually try and come down here and free those prisoners. It was not successful, and yet with the March to the Sea going on, a recent discovery, I believe, by a researcher in Statesboro at Georgia Southern has determined another camp actually existed near the southeast coast.
Well, and it's a Camp Lawton is the site you're referring to, and it's a remarkable example of what memory does. We've always known that Camp Lawton was part of our story, and certainly here it's mentioned in our exhibits, but Andersonville is sort of the Civil War prison that gobbles up all of the rest of them. That Camp Lawton was built in many respects to replace this prison. The Confederacy was fairly convinced, fairly certain that if and when Sherman occupied Atlanta, his next target would be Andersonville, and so a number of actions were taken, including building an elaborate defensive network around this facility, but also construction of new facilities, Camp Lawton being really the best example of that. They didn't know how the war was going to end up. We do. Those prisoners are moved into that Camp Lawton facility. About 11,000 men are housed there for only 6 weeks before the March to the Sea threatens it, and those prisoners are divided up between South Carolina, and then eventually many of them end up back here at Christmas Eve of 1864.
Which had to be a horror because more or less, based on the statistics, getting sent here was a death sentence.
It was, of course, out of 45,000 prisoners that are held here during the prison's existence, 30,000 live, or thereabouts. Now, exactly how long they live, some of them, when they're transferred from here to another prison, they may not live through that experience, but in the decades after the war, one of the reasons Andersonville is remembered so strongly compared to the others is one, the scale. This was more men were confined here than in any other one single place, and that has some consequences. And certainly, it led to the national park being established here.
The mortality rate at Andersonville was by far the worst, where 29% of the total 45,000 inmates would perish. The largest Union prisoner of war camp was located in Illinois at Camp Douglas. That's where over 30,000 Confederates would find equally horrible conditions. Of the 30,000 plus Johnny Rebs imprisoned there, 15%, or almost 4,500, would die. In all, there would be over 600,000 men killed in action during the Civil War. The records show that there were around 460,000 Confederate troops taken prisoner, Over 25,000 of them would die in Union POW camps. Over 210,000 Union soldiers were taken prisoner during the war, and of them, over 30,000 would die. Over one-third of all Union POWs who died during the Civil War drew their last breath at Andersonville.
Marker here marks the one corner of the stockade wall which would have held all the prisoners inside. Very cramped, very crowded, as we've shown you already. The conditions were just abhorrent. Now, the monument that you see in the background here was erected by the state of Wisconsin in 1906 to memorialize those who died here, 378 known casualties who died here at Camp Sumter.
Other states also took time to recognize their fallen at Andersonville. Rhode Island, Tennessee,
the tallest monument erected by the state of Ohio pays tribute to over 1,000 Ohioans who died here at Camp Sumter.
We'll be back with more of our visit to Andersonville, National Historic Site, after the break, as we pay tribute to our veterans on Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal.
Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal rolling on, and as we are close to Veterans Day, we are visiting Andersonville National Historic Site and the POW Museum here.
Clara Barton, best known for the founding of the American Red Cross, well, she began her career as a teacher in her teens, but by 1861, she was in Washington, D.C., and had become the first woman hired to work at the U.S. Patent Office.
Monuments honoring the dead and the fallen are here at Andersonville, and a monument here to the caregiver, erected in 1915 for Clara Barton, of course, the Red Cross, founder of that operation, which is still in existence and does so much in our communities today. She helped to preserve the names of the thousands who died here, but still many remain nameless.
Clara Barton plays a role in that. She, in the summer, of 1865, as the war is coming, finally coming to a close, and the long journey towards, in many respects, reconciliation is beginning, the U.S. Army sends an expedition here from the Quartermaster's Department to clean up the cemetery, transform it into a national cemetery, and Clara Barton uses her considerable political power to invite herself onto that expedition. And certainly the captain commanding that expedition, he'd want you to know that he wasn't real crazy about that woman inviting herself. What she brought with her was the presence of Dorrance Atwater, a young man who'd been confined here, had been captured in 1863, held at Belle Isle in Virginia, then transferred here. Dorrance Atwater, in the summer of 1864, is assigned duty as a clerk, keeping the paperwork of the prison, and the specific paperwork he kept was what's become known as the death list, the death register, and prisoners keeping track of the dying prisoners, the dead prisoners, and where they're being buried within the cemetery. Certainly, he had an imperative, a moral obligation in many respects to keep that paperwork up to the best of his ability, in many respects more than anyone else would. And in the summer of 1864, young Private Atwater also realized the value of that information he was keeping, and so he began to keep a copy. And when he was released, he walks that copy out and to the north, and that summer of 1865, he's trying to make that presence of his complete list known, and one of the people he notifies is Clara Barton. And again, immediately after having been held as a prisoner here for months, volunteering to come back, that's a difficult choice that many of us might not perhaps make, certainly when we're 19 or 20 years old.
The site of the former prison features recreations of the stockade wall in places, of the sites where troops tried digging wells or escape tunnels. Another monument stands where a miracle took place.
Now, the fountain you hear and see behind me says, "With charity to all and malice toward none." The survivors erected this monument in memory of their fallen and in honor of what they called Providence Spring. For after a storm, water began bubbling out, and it was pure water, drinking water. So it gave the men a chance for life. For not only was food and medicine in very short supply, even just potable water was hard to find for the prisoners at Andersonville.
The prisoners were desperately in need of food, clothing, medicine, and especially clean water. Years after the war was over, survivors donated money to place a fountain bowl at Providence Spring. The spring house was built in 1901 by the Women's Relief Corps of the Grand Army of the Republic. The GAR and the Women's Auxiliary were largely responsible for helping preserve the site of the prison and cemetery. Living conditions for the men inside Andersonville was, in a word, crowded. In one reconstruction, lean-tos and canvas tents gives visitors a chance to see what men penned inside used for their shelter. It's not hard walking through the recreation to imagine just how hard it was for the POWs. With the pigeon roosts overlooking the scene, both captive and captor must have found it unbearable. One captive wrote in his diary, quote, "Would that I was an artist and had the material to paint this camp and all its horrors, or the tongue of some eloquent statesman, and had the privilege of expressing my mind to our honored rulers in Washington. I should glory to describe this hell on earth where it takes 7 occupants to make a shadow." Sergeant David Kennedy, 9th Ohio Cavalry, Andersonville, July 9th, 1864. Sergeant Kennedy